The 3 coins felt slick and weightless in her palm, worn smooth by 1,000 other hands. They were all May had left in the world, and they were not enough. She knew it even before she pushed them across the splintered pine counter of the Redemption Gulch General Store. The air inside was thick with the scent of milled flour, coffee beans, and the cloying sweetness of licorice sticks in a glass jar. Outside, the Arizona sun beat down on the dusty street, bleaching the world to shades of white and pale brown, much like the threadbare dress she wore. Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor, looked down his spectacles at the meager offering. His lips, thin and precise, tightened into a smirk. He was a man whose generosity was measured in ounces, and whose respect was reserved for those who could pay in silver dollars. He prodded the coins with a fleshy finger, as if they were something unclean. "What is this, May?" he asked, his voice loud enough for the 2 other customers in the store to hear. "You think this buys a sack of flour and bacon? This might buy you a handful of dried beans, if you're lucky." A hot flush crept up May's neck. She kept her eyes fixed on a crack in the wooden counter, her back straight. Her husband Fang had told her to always hold her head high, even when her pockets were empty. But Fang was gone, taken by a fever that swept through the railroad camp 2 winters ago, leaving her with a small plot of land nobody wanted and a silence that filled every corner of their tiny cabin. "It is all I have for now, Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice a low murmur. "The garden has not yet produced." Abernathy let out a short, barking laugh. It was a cruel sound, sharp and without humor. "The garden," he scoffed. "That patch of dust you call a garden? The sun'll cook whatever you plant before it ever sees a dinner plate. This is charity, woman, and I am not a charitable man." The other customers, a rancher's wife and a young drover, shifted uncomfortably but did not intervene. In Redemption Gulch, a Chinese widow was a ghost, seen but not acknowledged, her troubles her own. May felt their averted gazes like a physical touch. She started to draw the coins back, the shame a bitter taste in her mouth. She would go without. She had done it before. The floorboards by the entrance groaned under a sudden weight. The lazy afternoon light from the doorway was blocked by a broad-shouldered silhouette. A man stepped inside, bringing a chill with him that had nothing to do with the temperature. The store fell silent. Even the buzzing of the flies seemed to cease. He was dressed in black from his worn boots to the flat-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. The dust of the trail clung to him, a second skin of gray on the dark fabric. His name was Jedediah Stone, and no one in town used it. They called him Stone, and they said it in whispers. He was a gunslinger, a man who made his living with the Colt Peacemaker holstered low on his hip. He moved with a deliberate, unnerving grace, his eyes taking in the entire room without seeming to move at all. Jedediah's gaze settled on the scene at the counter, the sneering shopkeeper, the humiliated woman, and the 3 pathetic coins between them. He didn't say a word. He simply walked to the far end of the counter, near the barrels of pickles and salted fish, and leaned against it, crossing his arms over his chest. He was watching. Abernathy's smirk faltered. The presence of the gunslinger changed the air in the room, charging it with a quiet menace. The shopkeeper cleared his throat, suddenly flustered. "As I was saying," he began, his voice losing its confident boom, "we all have our struggles." May finally looked up from the counter, her dark eyes meeting Jedediah's for a brief, startling moment. His face was weathered, carved by sun and hardship, but his eyes were a clear, pale gray. They held no judgment, only a deep, unsettling stillness. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, not to her, but toward the supplies she had requested. The gesture was small, but its meaning was unmistakable. Abernathy saw it and paled. He looked from the gunslinger's impassive face to May's quiet dignity, and the calculation in his eyes was plain to see. Antagonizing a poor widow was one thing. Antagonizing the man who had faced down 3 outlaws in this very street without flinching was another entirely. With a sigh that sounded more like a gasp, Abernathy swept the coins off the counter and into his till. He turned, grabbed a cloth sack, and began scooping flour into it with jerky, resentful movements. "Fine, fine," he muttered, not looking at either of them. "A bit of credit for a neighbor." Jedediah remained silent, his presence a heavy weight in the room. He pushed himself off the counter only when Abernathy had finished packing the flour, a slab of bacon, and a small bag of coffee beans. He walked over and placed a silver dollar on the counter. The coin rang with a clear, authoritative sound that made the 3 small coins seem even more pitiful. "And a bag of those apples," Jedediah said, his voice low and raspy, like stones grinding together. "And 2 cans of peaches, for the lady." Abernathy's eyes widened at the silver dollar, his greed warring with his fear. He quickly gathered the additional items, his earlier mockery replaced by a fawning, nervous energy. He pushed the heavy parcel toward May. "There you are, ma'am. Anything else?" May shook her head, her throat too tight to speak. She reached for the package, but Jedediah was already lifting it. "I'll carry it," he said. It wasn't a question. He turned and walked toward the door, holding the parcel easily in one arm. He paused on the threshold, looking back not at Abernathy, but at May. He was waiting for her. With a final fleeting glance at the shopkeeper, who now refused to meet her eyes, May gathered the thin fabric of her skirt and followed the dark figure out into the blinding sunlight. The walk to her cabin was less than a mile, but it felt like 100. The townsfolk they passed stopped and stared, their curiosity a palpable force. The feared gunslinger and the Chinese widow. It was a pairing that made no sense, and the town's collective mind churned with suspicion and gossip. Jedediah seemed oblivious to the stares. He walked at a steady pace, shortening his long stride slightly so she could keep up. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the crunch of their boots and the deep dust and the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. May's mind raced. Why had he done it? No one had ever stood up for her, not since Fing had died. Kindness from a stranger was a foreign currency in this land, and from a man like Jedediah Stone, it felt dangerous. Her cabin was little more than a dugout with a clapboard front, nestled against a low rise at the edge of town. It was small and poor, but the area around it was swept clean, and a few stubborn wildflowers grew in a patch near the door. Jedediah set the parcel down on the small, rickety porch. "Thank you," May said, finding her voice at last. It came out as a whisper. "I will pay you back as soon as I can." He looked at her, his gray eyes seeming to see more than she wanted. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes and the determined set of her jaw. "No need," he said. He tipped his hat, a gesture of finality, and turned to leave. But as he turned, his gaze drifted past her cabin to the thin line of green that snaked behind it. A small, persistent creek, no wider than a man's stride, bubbled up from a spring in the hills and cut through the back of her property. In the parched landscape of the Arizona Territory, where water was more precious than gold, that tiny creek was a lifeline. He stopped, his body going still. He did not yet know that the mocking shopkeeper was the least of her problems. He only knew that a woman alone, with land that held the only steady water for miles, was in a kind of trouble that a silver dollar couldn't fix. A few days passed in quiet routine. May worked her small garden, coaxing green shoots from the dry soil with water she hauled, bucket by bucket, from the creek. The food from the store gave her strength, but the memory of Jedediah's intervention left her unsettled. It was an act of charity she could not repay and did not understand. She saw him once, riding through town, a solitary figure moving with purpose, and her heart gave a strange, unfamiliar flutter. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, she saw him walking up the path to her cabin. He wasn't carrying his saddlebags, just a rifle in one hand and 2 rabbits tied by their feet in the other. He stopped at the edge of her porch, careful not to presume an invitation. "Figured you could use these," he said, holding up the rabbits. His voice was as gruff as before, but it seemed to hold less of an edge out here, away from the prying eyes of the town. May hesitated for only a second before wiping her hands on her apron. "Please," she said, gesturing to the porch. "Come, sit. I can make a stew." He nodded and sat on the top step, resting his rifle beside him. While she prepared the rabbits with an practiced efficiency born of necessity, he watched her work. Then his eyes fell on a loose board on the edge of the porch, a trip hazard she'd been meaning to fix for months. Without a word, he stood up, found a hammer and some nails in Thang's old tool chest by the wall, and secured the board with 3 swift, clean blows. The simple act of repair, of a man doing a man's work around her home, sent a pang of loneliness and gratitude through her, so sharp it almost made her gasp. They ate the stew on the porch as twilight settled, the sky turning a deep indigo pricked with the first stars. The stew was simple, flavored with wild onions she'd gathered by the creek, but it was hot and filling. For a long time they ate in a comfortable silence. "Why did you help me?" she finally asked, her voice barely disturbing the quiet. Jedediah swirled the last of the stew in his bowl, watching it as if the answer were written there. "I don't like to see folks getting kicked when they're down," he said simply. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light. "I knew a family once, back in Kansas. Good people. Had a small farm. A man with a fancy deed and a bigger purse wanted their land. He squeezed them, little by little. The town just watched. I was younger then. I watched too. I thought it wasn't my fight." He paused, the silence stretching out. "By the time I realized everyone's fight is your own, it was too late. They were gone." He didn't say more, but May understood. He wasn't a hero. He was a man carrying a regret, and in her humiliation, he had seen a chance to settle a debt with a ghost. She looked at the worn pair of Feng's work gloves she kept on the small mantel inside, their leather stiff and stained. Everyone had their ghosts. "My husband worked for the railroad," she offered, sharing a piece of her own story in return. "He believed in this country. He said it was a place where hard work could build a future. He worked until his body gave out." Jedediah nodded slowly. "Hard work ain't always enough." Their quiet moment was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. 2 riders, followed by a man in a buggy, pulled up before her cabin. The man in the buggy was dressed in a fine city suit, a stark contrast to the dusty landscape. He was stout, with a well-groomed mustache and eyes that were small and sharp. He stepped down from the buggy with an air of immense self-importance. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. He tipped his hat to May, but his eyes were on Jedediah, assessing him with a flicker of annoyance. "Mrs. Feng, I presume. My name is Marcus Thorne." Jedediah didn't move from his seat on the porch step, but his body had gone rigid. His hand rested casually on his thigh, inches from the handle of his Colt. "I am May," she said, standing up. "A pleasure," Thorne said, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "I represent the Transcontinental Railroad. We are expanding our operations through this territory and require certain parcels of land. Your property, as it happens, is one of them. I am authorized to offer you $50 for your claim. A generous offer, I think you'll agree, for a plot of this modest size." $50. It was more money than she had seen in her life. It was enough to buy a ticket back east, to leave Redemption Gulch and its painful memories behind. But it was also an insult. Feng had died helping build that railroad, and this land was all she had left of him. of his dream. And then she looked at the creek, her creek, and understood. It wasn't the land they wanted. It was the water. "The land is not for sale," May said, her voice quiet but firm. Thorne's smile tightened. "I believe you misunderstand, madam. This is not so much a request as a formality. The railroad gets what it needs. The $50 is a courtesy. You can take it and leave with some dignity, or you can be removed." He gestured to the two hard-faced men on horseback who watched them with cold indifference. "She said it's not for sale!" Jedediah's voice cut through the evening air, flat and final. Thorne finally turned his full attention to the gunslinger. "And you are her business manager?" The sarcasm was thick. "I'm the man telling you to get off her land," Jedediah replied, still not moving. Thorne's eyes narrowed. He recognized the tone. He recognized the stillness that precedes violence. He was a man who understood power, and he could see that the man sitting on the porch possessed a kind that money couldn't always buy. He looked from Jedediah's calm face to May's resolute one. "A mistake," Thorne said softly, the politeness returning to his voice, making it more menacing than before. "A very costly mistake. Accidents happen out here. Fires, cave-ins. Sometimes people just disappear. Think on my offer." With a final, chilling smile, he climbed back into his buggy. The two riders gave Jedediah a long, hard look before turning their horses and following Thorne back toward town, leaving a cloud of dust to settle in their wake. The night felt colder now. The threat lingered in the air, a poison that tainted the peaceful twilight. May wrapped her arms around herself, a shiver running through her despite the warm air. $50 to erase her husband's memory, to give up the only thing that was hers, or stay and face a man like Thorne. Jedediah finally stood up. He walked over to where she stood by the cabin door. "He won't give up," he said. "Men like that never do. They'll be back." "What can I do?" she whispered, the fear she had held back now threatening to overwhelm her. "You can sell," he said, his voice devoid of judgment. "Take the money and go somewhere safe." He paused. "Or you can stay, and you can let me help you." She looked up at his face, shadowed by his hat brim. He was offering her a choice. He was not a savior come to rescue her. He was a man offering to stand with her, to make her fight his own. To accept his help would be to tie her fate to a gunslinger, to invite more violence into her life, and to cement her status as an outcast in the town. But to refuse was to face Thorne alone. She thought of Fing's belief in hard work. She thought of the green shoots in her garden, a promise of life wrested from the unforgiving soil. This land was hers. She had bled for it, wept for it. She would not be scared away. "I will stay," May said, her voice clear and strong. "I will not run." A flicker of something, respect, perhaps even warmth, passed through Jedediah's gray eyes. "All right then," he said, as if she had just agreed to a simple business proposition. "First thing we do tomorrow is build a better fence, and I'll be sleeping in your barn, if you'll have me." It was not a declaration of love. It was a statement of intent. In the quiet of the coming night, under a sky full of distant, uncaring stars, two lonely people had chosen to stand together against the encroaching darkness. 3 months later, the punishing heat of summer had given way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The cottonwoods along the creek had turned a brilliant yellow, and the air carried the scent of wood smoke and dry leaves. May's small garden was a riot of color and life. Cornstalks stood tall, heavy with ears, and squash vines sprawled across the rich earth, their broad leaves hiding plump orange fruit. A series of small, clever irrigation ditches, lined with stones, carried water from the creek to the rows of vegetables. The land was no longer a patch of dust. It was a testament to water and work. Jedediah was a constant, quiet presence. He had moved his bedroll into the small, sturdy barn, and his days were spent in tandem with hers. He repaired the roof of the cabin, dug the ditches, and hunted for meat, while she tended the garden, cooked their meals, and turned their small homestead into a place of surprising abundance. They spoke little, but a deep, unspoken understanding grew between them. It was in the way he would leave a bucket of fresh water on her porch every morning, and the way she would leave a hot plate of food for him in the barn every evening. Thorne had tried to make good on his threat. A week after his visit, May had woken to the smell of smoke. A fire had been set in the dry brush at the edge of her property, but Jedediah, sleeping with the light, alert senses of a man used to danger, had been awake before the flames grew high. Together they had beaten the fire out with wet sacks, their faces smudged with soot, their lungs burning. Thorne's second attempt was more cunning. His men had tried to build a dam upstream to divert the creek and choke her land of its lifeblood. Jedediah had confronted them, not with the Colt on his hip, but with a piece of paper in his hand. He had spent 2 weeks quietly investigating Thorne, sending telegraphs to a contact he had in the territorial marshal's office. He discovered that Thorne's railroad claims were built on a foundation of fraud and forged deeds. The confrontation was brief and decisive. Faced with exposure and a federal warrant, Thorne and his men had vanished from Redemption Gulch overnight. The town, which had watched their strange partnership with suspicion, slowly began to change its tune. They saw the flourishing garden. They heard the story of how Thorne, who had been squeezing many of them for months, had been run out of the territory. Respect, in the West, was often a lagging indicator of survival. One afternoon, May walked into Abernathy's general store. The air was still thick with the same scents, but something was different. She was different. She placed a basket on the counter, filled with squash, corn, and tomatoes from her garden. Abernathy looked at the vibrant produce, then at her. Her dress was still simple, but it was clean and mended. There was a confidence in her posture that had not been there before. "I'd like to trade these," May said, "for some sugar, salt, and a length of blue calico cloth." The shopkeeper, who had once laughed at her poverty, now looked at her with a grudging admiration. He weighed the vegetables carefully. "It's a fair trade," he said, his tone even. "More than fair." He measured out her goods without a single sneer. As she turned to leave, he cleared his throat. "That's a fine garden you have, Mrs. Fing. A real fine garden." It was the closest he would ever come to an apology. Jedediah was waiting for her on the boardwalk outside, leaning against a post. He had taken to leaving his gun belt in the barn when he wasn't expecting trouble. Without it, he looked less like a gunslinger and more like a homesteader. His shoulders relaxed, the hard lines around his mouth softened. He took the parcel from her, and they started the walk home. They walked side by side, their hands occasionally brushing, sending a quiet warmth through her. They didn't speak of the future, of what they were to each other. There was no need. It was being built each day, in the shared work, the quiet meals, the steady companionship. When they reached the cabin, they stood for a moment on the porch he had repaired, looking out at the thriving land. The sun was setting, casting a gentle golden glow over everything, turning the dust to gold. It was a place of peace, a sanctuary they had built together. The 3 worthless coins that had started it all were long gone, spent on a sack of flour. But what they had purchased that day was something far more valuable. It was a future she never thought she would have, and a partnership with a quiet man who had seen her not as a helpless victim, but as someone worth fighting for. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.